It started on a morning so quiet you could hear the wind brushing past the picket fences, the kind of silence only a neatly trimmed neighborhood could produce. The lawns were pristine, the driveways were spotless, and the houses all looked like they'd been stamped from the same mold. Everything about the community screamed controlled perfection, and for the longest time I thought that was a good thing. I had only been living there for 6 months when I found the envelope taped to my front door. It was an official-looking letter, the kind printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the Homeowners Association seal embossed at the top. No greeting, no warmth, just a stiff notification. It read like a courtroom summons rather than a friendly reminder. According to the HOA, my Labrador, Scout, was a disruption to the visual harmony and peace of the neighborhood, and was therefore in violation of community standards. They were requesting his immediate removal. I stood there on the porch, the morning sun creeping higher over the rooftops, trying to wrap my head around what I had just read. Scout was the gentlest dog in the world. A 12-year-old with cloudy eyes and a stiff gait who preferred naps in the sun to chasing anything that moved. He barely barked, and when he did, it was only to announce the mailman or a squirrel. Yet here I was, being told my dog didn't fit into the image the HOA wanted to maintain. I didn't see my neighbors outside that morning, but I knew they were there, peering from behind their curtains. In neighborhoods like this, everyone saw everything. If one person had complained, odds were the entire board already knew, and the president of the HOA would treat it like a personal crusade. The president was a woman named Carol Whitman. Everyone called her Queen Carol when she wasn't within earshot. She was the kind of person who believed rules weren't just guidelines but sacred laws carved in stone. I'd seen her marching up and down the street with her clipboard, measuring grass height, frowning at garden gnomes, and issuing courtesy notices to anyone whose trash can lingered a minute too long at the curb. I tossed the letter onto my kitchen counter, but it might as well have been a lit stick of dynamite. All day I felt its weight in the room. I tried to focus on work, but my eyes kept drifting back to it, my stomach tightening with each glance. By evening, the paper had turned into a dare. They thought they could bully me, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, another envelope arrived, slipped right into my mailbox. This one wasn't a request. It was a formal violation notice. The HOA demanded Scout's removal within 10 days, or I'd be fined $200 for every day of noncompliance. They even threatened legal action if I refused. That night, I walked Scout along the street, passing Carol's house, the biggest on the block, with shutters painted HOA-approved beige and not a single blade of grass out of line. Her porch light clicked on the second we stepped onto the sidewalk. I could feel her eyes drilling into us from behind the blinds. Scout wagged his tail, oblivious, sniffing at the hedge as if nothing were wrong. But I knew this was just the beginning. I spent hours combing through the HOA bylaws, looking for any rule about pets. All I found was a single line about pets must not create excessive noise or disturbance. Scout didn't fit that description. There was nothing about size, breed, or even how many pets you could have. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. Carol wanted to flex hers, and she picked the wrong target. I started documenting everything. Every walk, every time Scout barked, every interaction with the neighbors. I even set up a small camera on my porch to record our comings and goings. I had a feeling I'd need proof sooner rather than later. The following weekend, I caught my first glimpse of how far Carol was willing to go. Early Saturday morning, while sipping coffee at my window, I saw her stop by my yard with 2 other HOA board members. They pointed at Scout's water bowl, at his favorite spot by the porch where he liked to nap in the sun. They wrote something down on Carol's clipboard, shook their heads, and walked away. That's when I realized this wasn't just a petty notice. They were building a case. Against me. Against my dog. By Monday, I received another letter. This one marked, final warning. If Scout wasn't gone by Friday, they would start the fines immediately and file for a lien against my house. A lien. Over a dog who'd never hurt anyone. Never even barked at a passing kid. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so serious. I looked at Scout lying on the rug, his tail thumping lazily as if he knew I was upset. There was no way I was giving him up. Not now, not ever. If the HOA wanted a fight, I'd give them one they'd never forget. Little did I know this fight would spiral out of control, dragging the whole neighborhood into chaos, pulling in lawyers, reporters, and even strangers from across the country. What started as a simple notice on my door was about to explode into a battle that would make national headlines. And Carol Whitman, for all her clipboards and bylaws, had no idea just how far I was willing to go to protect my dog. The clock was ticking. Friday was coming fast. Friday arrived faster than I wanted, but not before I'd made my first move. The HOA thought they were dealing with someone who would cave under pressure, someone who'd quietly haul their dog to a shelter rather than face mounting fines. They couldn't have been more wrong. The night before the deadline, I sent Carol Whitman a certified letter of my own, a formal dispute notice citing the HOA bylaws word for word. I included evidence, timestamps from the camera on my porch showing Scout's quiet days, records of his veterinary visits proving his age and calm temperament, even statements from 2 neighbors who swore they'd never heard him bark more than once or twice. It was airtight. If they pushed this, they'd be violating their own rules. But Carol didn't back down. Not even close. By noon Friday, another letter appeared, this time from the HOA's attorney. They were enforcing compliance and starting the $200 a day fines immediately. I couldn't believe how fast they moved. It was like they'd been planning this for weeks, just waiting for me to resist. The letters didn't stop there. Every morning, I'd find another envelope. The fines climbed higher and higher, a running tally designed to break me. By Sunday night, the total already stood at $1,000. And every neighbor in the subdivision knew it. Carol made sure of that. I saw her on the sidewalk that weekend, talking to people as they watered their flowers or unloaded groceries. She spoke in hushed tones, glancing at my house like it was some sort of crime scene. By evening, the whispers had spread. Suddenly, folks who used to wave when I walked Scout looked the other way. Others crossed the street entirely. Carol was turning the neighborhood against me, painting me as reckless, as someone who didn't respect the community. One family said she'd forced them to repaint their front door because the color wasn't neutral enough. Another told me she'd fine them for having their kids' bikes visible in the driveway. Scout might have been the excuse this time, but the real issue was power, Carol's endless need to control everything and everyone. I realized I couldn't just defend myself. I had to go on the offensive. The first thing I did was document every action Carol took against me. I kept a running log of every letter, every fine, every time I saw her outside my property. I downloaded copies of the HOA's own bylaws and highlighted every section she was violating by targeting me. And then I called in backup. A friend of mine from college worked as a local reporter. I told her everything. The letters, the fines, the absurd demand to remove an elderly dog who barely made a sound. She was stunned. This would make one heck of a story, she said. I asked her to hold off publishing just for now. I wanted to build my case before going public. Meanwhile, Carol doubled down. On Monday morning, I woke to find bright orange violation posters taped to my garage door, the kind usually reserved for condemned buildings. They read, "Non-compliant residents. Action required." The letters were 6 inches tall, impossible to miss. That was the moment I knew Carol had crossed a line. This wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. This was about humiliation. She wanted to shame me in front of the entire neighborhood. Instead of tearing the posters down, I left them up and added my own camera to capture every single neighbor who stopped to stare. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others took photos, probably to gossip later. By the afternoon, a couple of kids on bikes rode past chanting "bad neighbor" like it was a game. Carol must have been thrilled. But I wasn't angry. I was focused. That evening, I printed every HOA letter, every fine notice, and laid them out on my dining room table. I circled inconsistencies, highlighted where they violated their own regulations, and compiled everything into a neat, organized binder. Then I sent copies to my lawyer, a no-nonsense guy who loved nothing more than tangling with HOAs. His response was quick. "They have no case. If anything, you can sue them for harassment." That's when I decided to stop hiding and start fighting openly. I posted a long message on the neighborhood's private online board explaining the situation. Scout's age, the non-existent noise complaints, and the fines piling up without any legal basis. I didn't name Carol directly, but everyone knew exactly who I meant. Within hours, the thread exploded. Some neighbors sided with me immediately. Others defended the HOA, parroting Carol's line about protecting property values. The community was splitting in half, and I hadn't even gone public beyond our block yet. The next morning, I walked Scout like nothing had happened. Carol stood at her mailbox, glaring at me with that tight smile of hers. She thought she'd won. She thought the pressure, the fines, and the isolation would make me give in. But all she'd done was give me ammunition. I was done playing defense. The binder went to my lawyer. The photos and camera footage went to my reporter friend. And I started drafting a full complaint to the county, one that listed every single way the HOA president had abused her authority. The fight had officially left the quiet streets of our subdivision. The next battle wouldn't just be between me and Carol. It would be between her and anyone who'd ever been steamrolled by an overreaching HOA. And Scout, my sleepy old Labrador, would be the face of it all. By the end of that week, the neighborhood feud was no longer a private affair. It was about to go public and spiral completely out of Carol's control. By the end of the week, my quiet fight with the HOA was no longer confined to the manicured sidewalks of our neighborhood. The story was spilling past the hedges and into the wider world. It started small, just a curious mention on a local Facebook group run by my college friend, the reporter. But within a day, it was on her newspaper's website, complete with photos of Scout napping peacefully in the sun and shots of the bright orange violation posters that Carol Whitman had plastered on my garage door. The headline was simple but powerful. Homeowner threatened with fines over elderly dog. That was all it took. By Saturday morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Emails from reporters, calls from animal rights groups, even messages from strangers offering legal advice or just plain support. People were furious on my behalf. They didn't just see an HOA going after a homeowner. They saw a heartless board targeting a harmless old dog. Carol, however, saw none of this as a warning. Instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts. The HOA sent yet another letter, this time accusing me of public defamation of the community. They threatened to raise the fines to $500 a day if I didn't stop spreading misinformation. But the thing about bullies is they often mistake attention for weakness. Carol thought the growing spotlight would make me nervous, that I'd fold under the pressure of being at the center of it all. In reality, it only fueled me. For every threat she sent, I had my lawyer draft a sharper response. For every fine they tried to tack on, I compiled more evidence of their misconduct. Neighbors started to pick sides more openly now. Some people avoided eye contact entirely, pretending not to notice the cameras I'd mounted or the reporters occasionally parked at the curb. Others slipped by to drop off homemade treats for Scout or whispered words of encouragement when Carol wasn't looking. The neighborhood, once picture-perfect and eerily uniform, now felt fractured, lines drawn like cracks in a sidewalk. By the second week, the story had jumped from local news to regional outlets. A morning talk show mentioned it in passing during a segment about overzealous HOAs. The anchor smiled as they showed a picture of Scout sleeping under a tree with the caption, "The world's least offensive dog." And that's when everything shifted. National animal welfare organizations reached out. A well-known attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases offered to represent me pro bono, saying this case could set a major precedent. Social media was flooded with the hashtag #SaveScout, and my quiet cul-de-sac suddenly felt like a stage. Satellite vans with dish antennas parked outside the subdivision gates. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing footage of Carol storming up and down the sidewalks with her clipboard. Carol tried to counteract the bad press by holding an HOA emergency meeting. But instead of calming things down, it turned into a disaster. Someone recorded the entire thing and leaked it online. The video showed Carol pounding on the table, shouting about community standards and problem pets, while several homeowners challenged her authority. The clip went viral within hours. I watched as the comments flooded in. Strangers from all over the country, mocking her rigid attitude and calling for her resignation. Carol, however, refused to back down. She sent letters not just to me but to every resident, claiming that outsiders were trying to destroy the neighborhood's reputation. She framed herself as the victim of an online smear campaign. But the truth was undeniable. Her obsession had spiraled far beyond a single complaint about a dog. The fines she tried to impose had no legal foundation. The lien threats were baseless. And now the world was watching. Reporters started knocking on Carol's door, asking for comments. She refused to speak, but the sight of her slamming her shutters shut made for perfect footage. Meanwhile, Scout became a kind of mascot. People sent him toys, treats, even handwritten letters. I couldn't walk him without strangers honking in support or slowing down to shout encouragement from their car windows. Behind all the noise, I kept preparing for the inevitable legal showdown. My lawyer compiled a formal harassment complaint to file with the county and drafted a countersuit against the HOA board for abuse of authority and emotional distress. I knew Carol wouldn't quit voluntarily. Someone like her would fight until the bitter end, unless the law stopped her. As the third week rolled around, the HOA tried one last desperate move. They hired a private security company to patrol the neighborhood, claiming it was to keep reporters out. But everyone knew the real reason. Carol wanted to intimidate me. The sight of uniformed guards cruising past my driveway was laughable, and also deeply disturbing. But their heavy-handed tactics backfired spectacularly. A TV crew caught footage of the guards harassing a family who tried to visit me, and the clip aired on national television. Overnight, the narrative shifted again. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. This was about power, control, and ordinary homeowners fighting back against an out-of-control HOA. And through it all, Scout stayed the same. He lay in his favorite spot by the porch, dozing in the afternoon sun, blissfully unaware that his very existence had turned a quiet neighborhood into ground zero for a nationwide debate. By the end of that month, Carol was facing pressure not just from me but from inside her own board. Some members quietly reached out, saying they didn't agree with her crusade and feared the legal consequences. The once united HOA leadership was cracking apart under the weight of the spotlight. But Carol still refused to resign. Instead, she prepared for what she called the ultimate enforcement action. Though she wouldn't say what that meant, I could feel the tension rising with every passing day. Something big was coming, and I was ready for it. The neighborhood war had reached its peak, and the next move Carol made would determine just how far this battle would go. Carol Whitman was cornered, and everyone could see it. The local news vans, the reporters camped at the entrance to the subdivision, the neighbors whispering behind closed doors. All of it painted a clear picture. Her crusade against Scout had backfired spectacularly. But if there was one thing I'd learned about Carol, it was that she didn't retreat when she lost ground. She went on the offensive. The warning came on a Tuesday morning, when I woke to find not just another violation letter, but a thick packet stamped with the seal of the county court. Carol had convinced the HOA board to file an injunction against me. She was attempting to force a judge to order Scout's removal on the grounds of continued noncompliance and threat to community order. It was an absurd accusation, completely detached from reality. There had never been a single documented complaint of noise, aggression, or disturbance. But Carol wasn't relying on truth. She was relying on intimidation. A court order carried weight, and she thought the looming threat of legal action would finally break me. The packet was heavy in my hands, but instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of calm. I'd been preparing for this. My lawyer had already drafted a full countersuit against the HOA for harassment and abuse of power, backed by weeks of documented evidence. Every threatening letter, every baseless fine, every video of Scout quietly sunbathing while Carol patrolled the sidewalks like a self-appointed sheriff. The legal battle was now officially underway. Within days, the story exploded to an entirely new level. National morning shows aired segments about the HOA versus the dog, showing clips of Scout looking harmless as ever. Animal rights organizations staged small demonstrations outside the subdivision gates, holding signs that read, "Let Scout stay." Drone footage captured lines of people showing up just to take pictures with him. My sleepy Labrador, suddenly transformed into a symbol of resistance. But Carol wasn't finished. At an emergency HOA meeting, which, predictably, was leaked online within hours, she unveiled what she called her final enforcement strategy. She pushed a motion for the HOA to levy a special assessment against me to cover community legal costs. In other words, she wanted every homeowner in the neighborhood to pay for her personal vendetta. That decision fractured the board completely. Several members openly opposed her, saying she'd gone too far. Others were terrified to speak up, fearing Carol's wrath. Meanwhile, ordinary residents were furious. They hadn't signed up to bankroll a pointless fight against a harmless dog, especially not with national media painting the HOA as villains. The tension was so thick you could feel it walking down the street. Neighbors who used to chat casually over trimmed hedges now avoided each other, glancing nervously at every parked news van and hovering camera drone. The perfect suburban facade was cracking, and Carol was still charging forward like nothing was wrong. When the court date arrived, Carol showed up in full force, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 attorneys and a small entourage of loyal HOA members. But I wasn't alone either. My lawyer came prepared with a binder thicker than a phone book, filled with evidence showing the HOA had acted outside its own bylaws. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones extended like spears, hungry for quotes. The hearing was quick, almost anticlimactic. The judge reviewed the documents, frowned at the lack of any real complaints or violations, and denied Carol's injunction outright. There would be no court order to remove Scout. The HOA's case had collapsed before it even began. Carol, however, refused to accept defeat. That evening, while the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, I caught her on the sidewalk near my driveway with 2 of her allies, measuring my fence with a tape measure and jotting notes furiously. It was clear she was already hunting for a new angle, some fresh way to punish me. But every step she took only made her look worse. When local news aired footage of her prowling around with that tape measure, commentators openly questioned whether she was obsessed. Even her allies began to distance themselves, leaving her standing alone with her clipboard, shouting into the void. The neighborhood was reaching a breaking point. Residents were furious about the special assessment she'd tried to pass. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes calling for Carol's removal as HOA president. Someone even hung a banner on the subdivision entrance reading, "Save Scout, Fire Carol," and reporters made sure to film it. Through it all, Scout remained blissfully unaware. He still napped on the porch, still wagged his tail at passing kids, still lived his quiet, unbothered life. But I knew Carol was plotting something more desperate. The way she looked at my house as she passed, sharp, calculating, unblinking, told me she wasn't finished. By the start of the 4th week, I received the most shocking letter yet. A notice that the HOA board, under Carol's leadership, had voted to place a lien on my home for unpaid fines. The amount they claimed I owed had ballooned into the tens of thousands. Completely fabricated numbers designed to scare me. It was illegal, baseless, and reckless. But it also meant one thing. Carol was willing to risk everything, even the HOA's legal standing, just to get rid of Scout. That was her ultimate move, and it was going to destroy her. My lawyer moved fast, filing a countersuit that named Carol personally for overstepping her authority and attempting to abuse the HOA's power for personal revenge. The case wasn't just about me anymore. Other neighbors, tired of years of petty harassment, began adding their own complaints to the lawsuit. The HOA wasn't just fighting one homeowner now. They were fighting a growing wave of angry residents and a very public audience. Carol had lit the match. Now the entire neighborhood was on fire. The next chapter wouldn't just be about Scout or me. It would be about whether Carol Whitman could hold onto her power or watch it crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. The lien notice was the breaking point, not for me but for everyone else. Up until that moment, the fight had seemed like a personal feud between me and Carol Whitman. But the idea that the HOA president could invent tens of thousands of dollars in fake fines and strap them onto someone's home without legal cause terrified the entire community. What happened to me could happen to anyone. By the end of the week, a group of homeowners had organized an emergency meeting, not sanctioned by Carol or the HOA, but by the residents themselves. They were tired of living under constant surveillance, tired of the letters, tired of watching reporters swarm their once peaceful street. The quiet rebellion that had been brewing in whispers now roared out in the open. Flyers appeared on doorsteps calling for Carol's immediate removal as HOA president. Social media groups buzzed with neighbors trading stories of past harassment. Families fined for basketball hoops in their driveways. Elderly residents threatened for leaving trash bins out a few minutes too long. Children scolded for drawing chalk pictures on the sidewalk. People began to realize Scout wasn't an isolated target. Carol's war on my dog was just the latest in a long pattern of control. The lawsuit I filed against the HOA quickly gained new plaintiffs. One by one, neighbors came forward to add their names. By the end of the week, nearly a third of the subdivision had joined in. Each brought their own stack of evidence. Letters, photos, even recordings of Carol's tirades at board meetings. The case had grown far beyond anything she could contain. Reporters loved it. What had started as a quirky story about a sleepy Labrador was now framed as a battle for homeowners' rights. National news outlets sent crews to cover the growing revolt. Satellite trucks lined the entrance to the subdivision. Commentators debated the limits of HOA power on morning talk shows. The hashtag #FireCarol began trending alongside hashtag #SaveScout. Carol tried to rally her allies, but even her most loyal supporters were slipping away. The board members who once stood beside her now avoided her calls. Some quietly issued statements to the press claiming they'd been misled about the fines and the lien. Others resigned outright, unwilling to go down with her sinking ship. But Carol refused to surrender. She marched up and down the street with her clipboard as if nothing was wrong, issuing fresh violation notices to anyone with a flower bed out of line or a garden gnome in the yard. Every move she made only added fuel to the fire. People filmed her confrontations and uploaded them online, where they spread like wildfire. Clips of her yelling at residents went viral, drawing millions of views and cementing her as the poster child for power-hungry HOA presidents. Inside her own house, however, the pressure was clearly mounting. Reporters who camped outside said they saw deliveries of thick envelopes arriving daily. Legal notices, subpoenas, and letters from angry homeowners. Carol's once pristine front yard, perfectly trimmed and polished, now bore signs of stress. Weeds crept along the edges. The flowers wilted. She no longer had time to maintain the perfection she demanded from everyone else. Meanwhile, my lawyer worked tirelessly, coordinating the growing case. Every resident's testimony painted the same picture. Years of unchecked authority, petty fines, and bullying tactics. The lawsuit was no longer just about Scout. It was about ending Carol's reign for good. As the court date for the countersuit approached, momentum swung fully against her. A local news crew aired a half-hour investigative segment detailing every instance of Carol's abuse of power, complete with interviews from former HOA board members and legal experts calling her actions grossly unlawful. The broadcast ended with a slow-motion shot of Scout wagging his tail on my porch, a perfect symbol of everything Carol was trying and failing to destroy. The next morning, something remarkable happened. Dozens of neighbors gathered outside my house, holding signs of support. Some brought their own dogs. Others simply wanted to show solidarity. For the first time, the subdivision wasn't silent or divided. It was united against the person who had ruled it with fear for years. When Carol drove by in her immaculate SUV, the crowd turned to watch. For once, her sharp eyes and rigid posture didn't intimidate anyone. The mask of authority she'd worn so proudly was crumbling in plain view. That evening, the HOA board, what was left of it, held an emergency session. With reporters swarming the clubhouse and dozens of residents packing the room, the motion to remove Carol as president was finally introduced. The vote was swift. Even those who once supported her had no choice but to protect themselves. Carol Whitman was stripped of her title, escorted out under a wave of cameras and murmured cheers. But even in defeat, she refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. She stormed from the building, clutching her clipboard like a shield, muttering about ungrateful neighbors and community standards. Her removal was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The lawsuit was still moving forward. The fabricated lien on my home remained recorded with the county, waiting to be struck down by a judge. And though Carol no longer held office, she still faced personal legal consequences for what she had done. The subdivision felt different in the days that followed. Lighter, freer, almost celebratory. Children rode their bikes without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months now chatted on sidewalks, united by a shared sense of relief. But beneath the surface, there was an understanding that the fight wasn't truly over until the courts had the final say. As for Scout, he became a local celebrity. Photographers snapped pictures of him lounging on the porch, wagging his tail as if he knew he'd become the face of the resistance. People mailed treats and toys, and I received letters from strangers thanking me for standing up to an abusive HOA. But I knew the final chapter was still to come. Carol wasn't the type to disappear quietly. She was still out there, threatening countersuits, claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. And the legal battle to clear my name and protect my home was just about to reach its climax. The neighborhood had taken its stand. Now it was time for the courts to decide Carol's fate once and for all. The neighborhood had never seen anything like it. By the time the sun rose on the morning after the televised HOA meeting, the pristine streets were buzzing with reporters, news vans, and curious onlookers who wanted to catch a glimpse of the dog at the center of the scandal. Camera crews set up at the cul-de-sac entrance, microphones poised to capture every reaction, while homeowners peered nervously through curtains. What had once been an orderly community, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, neighbors waving politely, now looked like the site of a national event. The HOA president, furious that the meeting had gone viral overnight, tried to regain control. She called an emergency session, demanding that the board meet in private to contain the damage. But it was already too late. Clips of her red-faced outbursts, her pounding of the gavel, and her threats to have the dog forcibly removed had spread across every platform imaginable. The public wasn't just watching, they were taking sides. And overwhelmingly, they sided against her. The homeowner at the center of it all woke up to hundreds of messages. Strangers offering support, lawyers volunteering their services for free, advocacy groups promising to challenge the HOA's overreach. The family's dog, once accused of being dangerous and disruptive, was now a symbol of resistance against petty power. As the day unfolded, more cracks in the HOA's facade began to show. Former residents stepped forward with their own stories. Unfair fines, arbitrary rules, intimidation tactics. A retired couple shared how they had been threatened with foreclosure over a flower bed. A single mother recounted being humiliated over the color of her shutters. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one dog. It was about a pattern of abuse that people had endured in silence for years. The media swarmed the neighborhood. Satellite trucks parked along the street, reporters narrating live segments about the HOA power struggle gone wrong. Anchors across the country framed it as a classic David versus Goliath story. One family and their beloved pet standing up to an overreaching board. Even local politicians chimed in, sensing an opportunity to be on the side of public outrage. Behind closed doors, the HOA president panicked. She tried to downplay the controversy, issuing a carefully worded statement claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that the board deeply valued its residents. But her attempt to spin the narrative only backfired. The internet dug deeper, unearthing records of excessive fines and heavy-handed tactics that had long gone unnoticed. Every new revelation added fuel to the fire, and every attempt at damage control only made the board look more corrupt. Meanwhile, the homeowner leaned into the attention. They agreed to interviews, calmly explaining how the HOA had targeted their dog and how they refused to back down. Their composed, heartfelt words contrasted sharply with the president's abrasive behavior. They weren't just fighting for their own pet anymore. They were standing up for everyone who'd ever been bullied by an HOA drunk on power. The tipping point came when a national morning show invited the family and their dog onto live television. The sight of the so-called dangerous animal wagging its tail on camera, licking the host's hand, completely destroyed the HOA's credibility. Public opinion was now overwhelmingly one-sided. Viewers flooded the HOA's email inbox with angry letters, demanding the board step down. Sponsors who had quietly supported community programs withdrew their funding to distance themselves from the controversy. Within a week, pressure mounted to the point of no return. Several board members resigned, citing personal reasons. The HOA president tried to hold on, but the backlash was relentless. A petition circulated among residents calling for her removal, gathering signatures faster than anyone anticipated. Even her closest allies turned against her, realizing she had become a liability to the entire neighborhood. When the vote finally came, it wasn't even close. The president was ousted from her position in disgrace, escorted out of the clubhouse as cameras rolled. For years, she had ruled the community with an iron fist, but now she was just another resident, one who could no longer hide behind authority. The homeowner, victorious but humble, celebrated quietly. They didn't seek revenge or gloat. Instead, they worked with new board members to rewrite outdated rules, making them fairer and more transparent. The clause about pets violating community standards was eliminated entirely, replaced with reasonable guidelines everyone could agree on. The family's dog, once on the brink of being expelled, became a local celebrity. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before now stopped by to offer treats, take photos, and share their own stories of standing up to unfair rules. What started as a personal fight had grown into something far bigger, a movement against arbitrary authority and for the right to simply live in peace. As news crews packed up and the frenzy died down, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The lawns were still neatly trimmed, the driveways spotless, the air calm again. But something had changed. Residents no longer looked at their HOA board with quiet fear. They saw them as equals, accountable to the very people they were supposed to serve. In the end, one dog had accomplished what no one thought possible. It had exposed corruption, toppled a tyrant, and reminded everyone that even the smallest voice can spark the loudest change. And while the cameras eventually moved on to the next big story, the legend of the dog who stood up to an HOA president, and won, lived on in the neighborhood for years to come. The battle was over, the community transformed, and the dog remained happily in its home. Proof that standing firm against unreasonable power can inspire an entire neighborhood, and sometimes, an entire nation.